Hello, welcome back to Storytime. We are continuing with Sherlock Holmes. I had thought looking at the chapter or, the story contents, table of contents, that we were about halfway through, but looking at it, looks like we're about a third of the way through. There are a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories. And today we're going to do two of them, as usual. I was hoping to do more every week, but turns out that my work schedule isn't really allowing for 4 story times, only 3, and I want to keep the younger ages story times to 2, because that's what I had started the story time out for, was for younger ages. But oh wow, that's a lot of dropped. I'm sorry, I wonder if this is choppy or something. Interesting. Huh. Anyways, sorry about that. Let's go ahead and get started with Sherlock Holmes. The first adventure we're going to be reading is The Adventure of Silver Blaze. "I am afraid, Watson, that I shall have to go," said Holmes as we sat down together to our breakfast one morning. "Go? Where to?" "To Dartmoor, to King's Pyland." I was not surprised. Indeed, my only wonder was that he had not already been mixed up in this extraordinary case, which was the one topic of conversation through the length and breadth of England. For a whole day my companion had rambled about the room, with his chin upon his chest and his brows knitted, charging and recharging his pipe with the strongest black tobacco, and absolutely deaf to any of my questions or remarks. "Hi, Fairy, how you doing? Thanks for dropping in." Sorry about that. Fresh editions of every paper had been sent up by our newsagent, only to be glanced over and tossed down into a corner. Yet, silent as he was, I knew perfectly well what it was over which he was brooding. There was but one problem before the public which could challenge his powers of analysis, and that was the singular disappearance of the favourite for the Wessex Cup, and the tragic murder of its trainer. When, therefore, he suddenly announced his intention of setting out for the scene of the drama, it was only what I had both expected and hoped for. "I should be most happy to go down with you if I should not be in the way," said I. "My dear Watson, you would confer a great favour upon me by coming, and I think that your time will not be misspent, for there are points about this case which promise to make an absolutely unique one. We have, I think, just time to catch our train to Paddington, and I will go further into the matter upon our journey. You would oblige me by bringing with you your very excellent field-glass." And so it happened that an hour or so later I found myself in the corner of a first-class carriage flying along en route for Exeter, while Sherlock Holmes, with his sharp, eager face framed in his ear-flapped travelling cap, dipped rapidly into the bundle of fresh papers which he had produced at Paddington. I think this is possibly the first time... Oh, hi, John. How are you doing? I think this is the first time that we have the appearance of the ear-flapped traveling cap in the actual books. Or maybe it's in one of the longer stories. We'll see. We had just left Reading far behind us before we thrust the last of them under the seat and offered... before he thrust the last of them under the seat and offered me his cigar case. "We are going well," said he, looking out the window and glancing at his watch. "Our rate at present is 53.5 miles an hour." "I have not observed the quarter-mile posts," said I. "Nor have I, but the telegraph posts upon this line are 60 yards apart, and the calculation is a simple one. I presume that you have already looked into this matter of the murder of John Straker and the disappearance of Silver Blaze?" I have seen that what the Telegraph and the Chronicle have to say. It is one of those cases where the art of the reasoner should be used rather for the sifter of ideas than for the acquiring of fresh evidence. The tragedy has been so uncommon, so complete, and of such personal importance to so many people that we are suffering from a plethora of surmise, conjecture, and hypothesis. The difficulty is to detach the framework of fact, of absolute, undeniable fact, from the embellishments of theorists and reporters. Then, having established ourselves upon this sound basis, it is our duty to see what inferences may be drawn, and which are the special points upon which the whole mystery turns. On Tuesday evening I received telegrams, both from Colonel Ross, the owner of the horse, and from the Inspector Gregory, who is looking after the case, inviting my cooperation. "Tuesday morning!" I exclaimed, "and this is Thursday morning? Why did you not go down yesterday?" "Because I made a blunder, my dear Watson, which is, I am afraid, a more common occurrence than anyone would think who only knew me through your memoirs. The fact is that I could not believe it possible that the most remarkable horse in England could long remain concealed, especially in so sparsely inhabited a place as the north of Dartmoor. From hour to hour yesterday I expected to hear that he had been found and that his abductor was the murderer of John Straker. Then, however, another morning had come, and I found that beyond the arrest of young Fitzroy Simpson, nothing had been done. I felt that it was time for me to take action. Yet in some ways I feel that yesterday has not been wasted." "You have formed a theory, then?" "At least I have got a good grip of the essential facts of the case. I shall enumerate them to you, for nothing clears up a case so much as stating it to another person, and I can hardly expect your cooperation if I do not show you the position from which we start." I lay back against the cushions, puffing at my cigar, while Holmes, leaning forward, with his long, thin forefinger, checked off the points upon the palm of his left hand, gave me a sketch of the events which had led to our journey. "Silver Blaze," said he, "is from the isonomy stock, and holds as brilliant a record as his famous ancestor. He is now in his 5th year, and has brought in turn each of the prizes of the turf to Colonel Ross, his fortunate owner. Up to the time of the catastrophe, he was first favourite for the Wessex Cup, the betting being 3-1 on. He has always, however, been a prime favourite with the racing public, and has never yet disappointed them, so that even at those odds enormous sums of money have been laid upon him. It is obvious, therefore, that there were many people who had the strongest interest in preventing Silver Blaze from being there at the fall of the flag next Tuesday. This fact was, of course, appreciated at King's Pyland, where the Colonel's training stable is situated. Every precaution was taken to guard the favourite. The trainer, John Straker, is a retired jockey who rode in Colonel Ross's colours before he became too heavy for the weighing chair. He has served the Colonel for 5 years as jockey, and for 7 as trainer, and has always shown himself to be a zealous and honest servant. Under him were 3 lads, for the establishment was a small one, containing only 4 horses in all. One of these lads sat up each night in the stable, where the others slept in the loft. All 3 bore excellent characters. John Straker, who was a married man, lived in a small villa about 200 yards from the stable. He has no children, keeps 1 maidservant, and is comfortably off. The country road is very lonely, but about half a mile to the north there is a small cluster of villas which have been built by a Tavistock contractor for the use of invalids and others who may wish to enjoy the pure Dartmoor air. Tavistock itself lies 2 miles to the west, which across the moor. Also about 2 miles distant is the larger training establishment of Mapleton, which belongs to Lord Backwater, and is managed by Silas Brown. I knew a guy named Silas Brown. He was really nice and had a good voice. In every other direction, the moor is a complete wilderness inhabited only by a few roaming gypsies. Such was the general situation last Monday night when the catastrophe occurred. On that evening, the horses had been exercised and watered as usual, and the stables were locked up at 9 o'clock. Two of the lads walked up to the trainer's house, where they had supper in the kitchen, while the third, Ned Hunter, remained on guard. At a few minutes after 9, the maid, Edith Baxter, carried down to the stables his supper, which consisted of a dish of curried mutton. She took no liquid, as there was a water tap in the stable, and it was the rule that the lad on duty should drink nothing else. The maid carried a lantern with her, as it was very dark, and the path ran across the open moor. Edith Baxter was within 30 yards of the stable when a man appeared out of the darkness and called to her to stop. As he stepped into the circle of yellow light thrown by the lantern, she saw that he was a person of gentlemanly bearing, dressed in a grey suit of tweed with a cloth cap. He wore gaiters and carried a heavy stick with a knob to it. She was not impressed, however, by the extreme pallor of his face, and by the nervousness of his manner. His age, she thought, would be rather over 30 than under it. "Can you tell me where I am?" he asked. "I had almost made up my mind to sleep on the moor when I saw the light of your lantern." "You are close to the King's Pyland training stables," she said. "Oh, indeed! What a stroke of luck!" he cried. "I understand that a stable boy sleeps here alone every night. Perhaps that is his supper which you carry to him? Now I am sure that you would not be too proud to earn a price for a new dress, would you?" He took a piece of white paper folded up out of his waistcoat pocket. "See that the boy has this tonight, and you shall have the prettiest frock that money can buy." She was frightened by the earnestness of his manner, and ran past him to the window through which she was accustomed to hand meals. It was already open, and Hunter was seated at the table, a small table inside. She had begun to tell him of what had happened, when the stranger came up again. "Good evening," said he, looking through the window. "I want to have a word with you." The girl had sworn that as he spoke, she noticed the corner of the little paper packet protruding from his closed hand. "What business have you here?" asked the lad. "It's business that may put something into your pocket," said the other. "You've 2 horses in for the Wessex Cup, Silver Blaze and Bayard. Let me have the straight tip, and you won't be a loser. Is it a fact that at the weights Bayard could give the other 100 yards in 5 furlongs, and that the stable have put their money on it?" "So you're one of those damned touts," cried the lad. "I'll show you how we serve them in King's Pyland." He sprang up and rushed across the table to unloose the dog. The girl flew away to the house, but as she ran she looked back and saw that the stranger was leaning through the window. A minute later, however, when Hunter rushed out with the hound, he was gone. And though the lad ran all round the building, he failed to find any trace of him. "One moment," I asked. "Did the stable boy, when he ran out with the dog, leave the door unlocked behind him?" "Excellent, Watson, excellent," murmured my companion. The importance of the point struck me so forcibly that I sent a special wire to Dartmoor yesterday to clear the matter up. The boy locked the door before he left it. The window, I may add, was not large enough for a man to get through. Hunter waited until his fellow grooms had returned, when he sent a message up to the trainer and told him what had happened. Straker was excited at hearing the account, although he does not seem to have quite realized its true significance. It left him, however, vaguely uneasy, and Mrs. Straker, walking at 1 in the morning, found that he was dressed. Waking at 1 in the morning, sorry. In reply to her inquiries, he said that he could not sleep on account of his anxiety about the horses, and that he intended to walk down to the stables to see that all was well. She begged him to remain at home, as she could hear the rain pattering against the windows, but in spite of her entreaties he pulled on his large mackintosh and left the house. Mrs. Straker awoke at 7 in the morning to find that her husband had not yet returned. She dressed herself hastily, called a maid, and set off for the stables. The door was open. Inside, huddled together upon a chair, Hunter was sunk in a state of absolute stupor. The favorite stall was empty, and there was no sign of his trainer. The two lads who slept in the chaff-cutting loft above the harness room were quickly aroused. They had heard nothing during the night, for they were both sound sleepers. Hunter was obviously under the influence of some powerful drug, and as no sense could be got out of him, he was left to sleep it off, while the two lads and the two women ran out in search of the absentees. They still had hopes that the trainer had for some reason taken out the horse for early exercise, but on ascending the knoll near the house from which all the neighboring moors were visible, they not only could see no signs of the favorite, but they perceived something which warned them that they were in the presence of a tragedy. About a quarter of a mile from the stables, John Straker's overcoat was flapping from a furze bush. Immediately beyond, there was a bowl-shaped depression in the moor, and at the bottom of this was found the dead body of the unfortunate trainer. His head had been shattered by a savage blow from some heavy weapon, and he was wounded in the thigh, where there was a long, clean cut inflicted evidently by some very sharp instrument. It was clear, however, that Straker had defended himself vigorously against his assailant, for in his right hand he held a small knife which was clotted with blood up to the handle, while in his left he grasped a red and black silk cravat, which was recognized by the maid as having been worn on the preceding evening by the stranger who had visited the stables. Hunter, on recovering from his stupor, was also quite positive as to the ownership of the cravat. He was equally certain that the same stranger had, while standing at the window, drugged his curried mutton, and so deprived the stables of their watchman. As to the missing horse, there were abundant proofs in the mud which lay at the bottom of the fatal hollow that he had been there at the time of the struggle. But from that morning he had disappeared, and although a large reward has been offered, and all the gypsies of Dartmoor are on the alert, no news has come of him. Finally, an analysis has shown that the remains of his supper left by the stable lad contained an appreciable amount of powdered opium, while the people in the house partook of the same dish on the same night without any ill effect. Those are the main facts of the case, stripped of all surmise and stated as blandly as possible. I shall now recapitulate what the police have done in the matter. Inspector Gregory, to whom the case has been committed, is an extremely competent officer. Were he but gifted with imagination, he might rise to great heights in his profession. On his arrival, he promptly found and arrested the man upon whom suspicion naturally rested. There was little difficulty in finding him, for he inhabited one of those villas which I have mentioned. His name, it appears, was Fitzroy Simpson. He was a man of excellent birth and education, who had squandered a fortune upon the turf, and who lived now by doing a little quiet and genteel bookmaking in the sporting clubs of London. An examination of his betting book shows that bets to the amount of £5,000 had been registered by him against the favourite. On being arrested, he volunteered the statement that he had come down to Dartmoor in the hopes of getting some information about the King's Pyland horses, and also about the Desborough, the second favourite, which was in charge of Silas Brown at the Mapleton stables. He did not attempt to deny that he had acted as described upon the evening before, but declared that he had no sinister designs, and had simply wished to obtain first-hand information. When confronted with his cravat, he turned very pale, and was utterly unable to account for its presence in the hand of the murdered man. His wet clothing showed that he had been out in the storm of the night before, and his stick, which was a penning lawyer, interesting, weighted with lead, was just such a weapon as might, by repeated blows, have inflicted the terrible injuries to which the trainer had succumbed. On the other hand, there was no wound upon his person, while the state of Straker's knife would show that one, at least, of his assailants must bear his mark upon him. There you have it all in a nutshell, Watson, and if you can give me any light, I shall be infinitely obliged to you. I had listened with the greatest interest to the statement which Holmes, with characteristic clearness, had laid before me. Though most of the facts were familiar to me, I had not sufficiently appreciated their relative importance, nor their connection to each other. Is it not possible, I suggested, that the incised wound upon Straker may have been caused by his own knife in the convulsive struggles which follow any brain injury? It is more than possible, it is probable, said Holmes. In that case, one of the main points in favor of the accused disappears. And yet, said I, even now I fail to understand what the theory of the police can be. I'm afraid that whatever theory we state had very grave objections to it, returned my companion. The police imagine, I take it, that the Fitzroy Simpson, having drugged the lad, and having in some way obtained a duplicate key, opened the stable door and took out the horse with the intention, apparently, of kidnapping him altogether. His bridle is missing, so that Simpson must have put this on. Then, having left the door open behind him, he was leading the horse away over the moor, when he was either met or overtaken by the trainer. A row naturally ensued. Simpson beat out the trailer's brains with his heavy stick without receiving any injury from the small knife which Straker used in self-defense, and then the thief either led the horse on to some secret hiding place, or else it may have bolted during the struggle, and be now wandering about on the moors. That is the case as it appears to the police, and improbable as it is, all other explanations are more improbable still. However, I shall very quickly test the matter when I am once upon the spot, and then when I really cannot see how we can get further than our present position. It was evening before we reached the little town of Tavistock, which lies like the boss of a shield in the middle of the huge circle of Dartmoor. Two gentlemen were awaiting us at the station, the one a tall, fair man with lion-like hair and beard, and curiously penetrating light blue eyes, the other a small, alert person, very neat and dapper, in a frock coat and gaiters, with trim little side whiskers and an eyeglass. The latter was Colonel Ross, the well-known sportsman, the other Inspector Gregory, a man who was rapidly making his name in English detective service. "I am delighted that you have come down, Mr. Holmes," said the Colonel. "The Inspector here has done all he could possibly be suggested, but I wish to leave no stone unturned in trying to avenge poor Straker and in recovery of my horse." "Have there been any fresh developments?" asked Holmes. "I am sorry to say that we have made very little progress," said the Inspector. "We have an open carriage outside, and as you would no doubt like to see the place before the light fails, we might talk it over as we drive." A minute later we were all seated in a comfortable landau, and were rattling through the quaint old Devonshire town. Inspector Gregory was full of his case, and poured out a stream of remarks, while Holmes threw in an occasional question or interjection. Colonel Ross leaned back with his arms folded, and his hat tilted over his eyes, while I listened with interest to the dialogue of the two detectives. Gregory was formulating his theory, which was almost exactly what Holmes had foretold in the train. "The net is drawn pretty close round Fitzroy Simpson," he remarked, "and I believe myself that he is our man. At the same time, I recognize that the evidence is purely circumstantial, and that some new development may upset it. How about Straker's knife? We have quite come to the conclusion that he wounded himself in his fall. My dear Dr. Watson made that suggestion to me as we came down. If so, it would tell against this man Simpson. Undoubtedly. He has neither a knife nor any sign of a wound. The evidence against him is certainly very strong. He has had a great interest in the disappearance of the favorite. He lies under the suspicion of having poisoned the stable boy. He was undoubtedly out in the storm. He was armed with a heavy stick, and his cravat was found in the dead man's hand. I really think we have enough to go before a jury. Holmes shook his head. A clever counselor could tear it all to rags, said he. Why should he take the horse out of the stable? If he wished to injure it, why could he not do it there? Has a duplicate key been found in his possession? What chemist sold him the powdered opium? Above all, where could he, a stranger to the district, hide a horse, and such a horse as this? What is his own explanation as to the paper which he wished the maid to give to the stable boy? He says that it was a 10-pound note. One was found in his purse. But your other difficulties are not so formidable as they seem. He is not a stranger to the district. He has twice lodged at Tavistock in the summer. The opium was probably brought from London. The key, having served its purpose, would be hurled away. The horse may lie at the bottom of one of the pits or old mines upon the moor. What does he say about the cravat? He acknowledges that it is his, and declares that he had lost it. But a new element has been introduced into the case, which may account for his leading the horse from the stable. Holmes pricked up his ear. We have found traces which show that a party of gypsies encamped on Monday night within a mile of the spot where the murder took place. On Tuesday they were gone. Now, presuming that there was some understanding between Simpson and these gypsies, might he not have been leading the horse to them when he was overtaken, and may they not have him now? It is certainly possible. The moor is being scoured for these gypsies. I have also examined every stable and outhouse in Tavistock, and for a radius of 10 miles. There is another training stable quite close, I understand? Yes, and that is a factor which we must certainly not neglect. As Desborough, their horse, was second in the betting, they had an interest in the disappearance of the favorite. Silas Brown, the trainer, is known to have had large bets upon the event, and he was no friend to poor Straker. We have, however, examined the stables, and there is nothing to connect him with the affair. And nothing to connect this man Simpson with the interests of the Mapleton stables? Nothing at all. Holmes leaned back in the carriage, and the conversation ceased. A few minutes later, our driver pulled up at a neat little red brick villa with overhanging eaves which stood by the road. Some distance off, across a paddock, lay a long grey-tiled outbuilding. In every other direction the low curves of the moor, bronze-colored from the fading ferns, stretched away to the skyline, broken only by the steeples of Tavistock and by a cluster of houses away to the westward, which marked the Mapleton stables. We all sprang out with the exception of Holmes, who continued to lean back into with his eyes fixed upon the sky in front of him, entirely absorbed in his own thoughts. It was only when I touched his arm that he roused himself with a violent start and stepped out of the carriage. "Excuse me," said he, turning to Colonel Ross, who had looked at him in some surprise. "I was daydreaming." There was a gleam in his eyes and a suppressed excitement in his manner which convinced me, used as I was to his way, that his hand was upon a clue, though I could not imagine where he had found it. "Perhaps you would prefer at once to go on to the scene of the crime, Mr. Holmes?" said Gregory. "I think that I should prefer to stay here a little and go into one or two questions of detail. Straker was brought back here, I presume?" "Yes, he lies upstairs. The inquest is tomorrow." "He has been in your service some years, Colonel Ross?" "I have always found him an excellent servant." "I presume that you made an inventory of what he had in his pocket at the time of his death, Inspector?" "I have the things themselves in the sitting-room if you would care to see them." "I should be very glad." We all filed into the front room and sat round the central table while the inspector unlocked a square tin box and laid a small heap of things before us. There was a box of Vestas, 2 inches of tallow candles, an ADP briar-root pipe, a touch of sealskin with half an ounce of long-cut Cavendish, a silver watch with a gold chain, 5 sovereigns in gold, an aluminum pencil case, a few papers, and an ivory-handled knife with a very delicate and flexible blade marked Weiss and Company, London. "This is a very singular knife," said Holmes, lifting it up and examining it minutely. "I presume, as I see blood stains upon it, that it is the one which was found in the dead man's grip. Watson, this knife is surely in your line." "It is what we call a cataract knife," said I. "I thought so. A very delicate blade, devised for very delicate work. Strange thing for a man to carry with him upon a rough expedition, especially as it would shut up in his pocket. It would not shut in his pocket." "The tip was guarded by a disc of cork which we found beside his body," said the inspector. "His wife tells us that the knife had lain for some days upon the dressing-table, and that he had picked it up as he left the room. It was a poor weapon, but perhaps the best that he could lay his hands on at the very moment." "Very possible. How about these papers?" "3 of them are receipted hay dealers' accounts. One of them is a letter of instructions from Colonel Ross. This other is a milliner's account for £37.15, made out by Madame Lesurier of Bond Street to William Derbyshire. Mrs. Straker tells us that Derbyshire was a friend of her husband's, and that occasionally his letters were addressed here." "Madame Derbyshire had somewhat expensive tastes," remarked Holmes, glancing down the account. 22 guineas is rather heavy for a single costume. However, there appear to be nothing more to learn, and we may now go down to the scene of the crime. As we emerged from the sitting room, a woman who had been waiting in the passage took a step forward and laid her hand upon the inspector's sleeve. He faced her. Oh my goodness. Her face was haggard and thin and eager, stamped with the print of a recent horror. "Have you got them? Have you found them?" she panted. "No, Mrs. Straker, but Mr. Holmes here has come from London to help us, and we shall do all that is possible." "Surely I met you in Plymouth at a garden party some little time ago, Mrs. Straker," said Holmes. "No, sir, you are mistaken." "Dear me. Why, I could have sworn it. You wore a costume of dove-colored silk with ostrich feather trimming." "I never had such a dress, sir," answered the lady. "Ah, that quite settles it," said Holmes, and with an apology he followed the inspector outside. A short walk across the moor took us to the hollow in which the body had been found. At the brink of it was the furze bush upon which the coat had been hung. "There was no wind that night, I understand," said Holmes. "None, but very heavy rain." "On that case, the overcoat was not blown against the furze bush, but placed here." "Yes, it was laid across the bush." "You fill me with interest. I perceive that the ground has been trampled upon a good deal. No doubt many feet have been here since Monday night. A piece of matting has been laid here at the side, and we have all stood upon that." "Excellent. In this bag I have one of the boots which Straker wore, one of Fitzroy Simpson's shoes, and a cast horseshoe of Silver Blaze." "My dear inspector, you surpass yourself." Holmes took the bag. Descending into the hollow, he pushed the matting down a more central position. Then, stretching himself upon his face and leaning his chin upon his hands, he made a careful study of the trampled mud in front of him. "Hallo!" said he suddenly. "What's this?" It was a wax vesta, half burned, which was so coated with mud that it looked at first like a little chip of wood. "I cannot think how I came to overlook it," said Inspector, with an expression of annoyance. It was invisible, buried in the mud. I only saw it because I was looking for it. What? You expected to find it? I thought it not likely. He took the boots from the bag and compared the impressions of each of them with the marks upon the ground. Then he clambered up to the rim of the hollow and crawled about among the ferns and bushes. I'm afraid that there are no more tracks, said the inspector. I have examined the ground very carefully for 100 yards in each direction. Indeed, said Holmes, rising. I should not have the impertinence to do it again after what you say, but I should like to take a little walk over the moor before it grows dark, that I may know my ground tomorrow, and I think that I shall put this horseshoe into my pocket for luck. Colonel Ross, who had shown some signs of impatience in my companion's quiet and systematic method of work, glanced at his watch. I wish you would come back with me, Inspector, said he. There are several points in which I should like your advice, and especially as to whether we do not owe it to the public to remove your horse's name from the entries for the cup. Certainly not, cried Holmes with decision. I should let the name stand. The colonel bowed. I am very glad to have had your opinion, sir, said he. You will find us at poor Straker's house when you have finished your walks, and we can drive together into Tavistock. He turned back with the inspector, while Holmes and I walked slowly across the moor. The sun was beginning to sink behind the stables of Mapleton, and the long, sloping plain in front of us was tinged with gold, deepening into rich, ruddy brown, where the ferns... Water went down the wrong pipe. We turned back with the inspector, while Holmes and I walked slowly across the moor. The sun was beginning to sink behind the stables of Mapleton, and the long sloping plains in front of us was tinged with gold, deepening into rich, ruddy brown, where the faded ferns and brambles caught the evening light. But the glories of the landscape were all wasted upon my companion, who was sunk in the deepest thought. It's this way, Watson, he said at last. We may leave the question of who killed John Straker for the instant, and confine ourselves to finding out what has become of the horse. Now, supposing that he broke away during or after the tragedy, where could he have gone to? The horse is a very gregarious creature. He left to himself his instincts would have been either to return to King Pylands or to go over to Mapleton. Why should he run wild upon the moor? He would surely have been seen by now. And why should gypsies kidnap him? These people always clear out when they hear of trouble, for they do not wish to be pestered by the police. They could not hope to sell such a horse. They would run a great risk and gain nothing by taking him. Surely that is clear. Where is he, then? I have already said that he must have gone to King Pylands or to Mapleton. He is not at King Pylands, therefore he is at Mapleton. Let us take that as a working hypothesis and see what it leads us to. This part of the moor, as the inspector remarked, is very hard and dry, but it falls away toward Mapleton, and you can see from here that there is a long hollow over yonder which must have been very wet on Monday night. If our supposition is correct, then the horse must have crossed that, and there is the point where we should look for the tracks. We had been walking briskly during this conversation, and a few more minutes brought us to the hollow in question. At Holmes' request, I walked down the bank to the right, and he to the left, but I had not taken 50 paces before I heard him give a shout, and saw him waving his hand at me. The track of a horse was plainly outlined in the soft earth in front of him, and the shoe which he took from his pocket exactly fitted the impression. See the value of imagination, said Holmes. It is the one quality which Gregory lacks. We imagined what might have happened, acted upon the supposition, and find ourselves justified. Let us proceed. We crossed the marshy bottom and passed over a quarter of a mile of dry, hard turf. Again the ground sloped, and again we came on the tracks. Then we lost them for half a mile, but only to pick them up once more quite close to Mapleton. It was Holmes who saw them first, and he stood pointing with a look of triumph upon his face. A man's track was visible beside the horse's. "The horse was alone before," I cried. "The horse was alone before," I cried. "Quite so. It was alone before. Hullo, what is this?" The double track turned sharp off and took the direction of King's Pyland. Holmes whistled, and we both followed after it. His eyes were on a trail, but I happened to look a little to one side, and saw to my surprise the same tracks coming back again in the opposite direction. "One for you, Watson," said Holmes when I pointed it out. "You have saved us a long walk, which would have brought us back on our own tracks. Let us follow the return tracks." We had not to go far. It ended at the paving of asphalt which led up to the gates of Mapleton stables. As we approached, a groom ran out from them. "We do not want any loiterers about here," said he. "I only wished to ask a question," said Holmes, with his finger and thumb in his waistcoat pocket. "Should I be too early to see your master, Mr. Silas Brown, if I were to call at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning?" "Bless you, sir, if anyone is about, he will be, for he is always the first stirring. But there he is, sir, to answer your question for himself." No, sir, no. It's as much as my place is worth to let him see me touch your money afterwards, if you like." As Sherlock Holmes replaced the half-crown which he had drawn from his pocket, a fierce-looking elderly man strode out from the gate with a hunting-crop swinging in his hand. "What's this, Dawson?" he cried. No gossiping, go about your business. And you, what the devil you want here?" "10 minutes' talk with you, my good sir," said Holmes in the sweetest of voices. "I've no time to talk to every gadabout. We want no strangers here. Be off, or you may find a dog at your heels." Holmes leaned forward and whispered something in the trainer's ear. He started violently and flushed to the temples. "It's a lie!" he shouted. "An infernal lie!" "Very good. Shall we argue about it here in public, or talk it over in your parlor?" "Oh, come in if you wish to." Holmes smiled. Excuse me. Holmes smiled. "I should not keep you more than a few minutes, Watson," he said. "Now, Mr. Brown, I am quite at your disposal." It was quite 20 minutes, and the reds had all faded into grays before Holmes and the trainer reappeared. Never have I seen such a change as had been brought about in Silas Brown in that short time. His face was ashy pale, beads of perspiration shone about his brow, and his hands shook until the hunting-crop wagged like a branch in the wind. His bullying, overbearing manner was all gone too, and he cringed along at my companion's side like a dog with his master. "Your instructions will be done. It shall be done," said he. "There must be no mistake," said Holmes, looking round at him. The other winced as he read the menace in his eyes. "Oh, no, there shall be no mistake. It shall be there. Should I change it first or not?" Holmes thought a little, and then burst out laughing. "No, don't," said he. "I shall write to you about it. No tricks now, or, oh, you can trust me, you can trust me." "Yes, I think I can." "Well, you shall hear from me tomorrow." He turned upon his heels, disregarding the trembling hand which the other held out to him, and we set off for King's Pyland. A more perfect compound of the bully, coward, and sneak with Master Silas Brown I have seldom met with, remarked Holmes as we trudged along together. "He has the horse, then?" "He tried to bluster out of it, but I described to him so exactly what his actions had been upon that morning that he is convinced that I was watching him. Of course you observed the peculiarly square toes in the impression, and that his own boot exactly corresponded to them. Again, of course, no substitute would have dared to have done such a thing. I described to him how, when, according to his custom, he was the first down, he perceived a strange horse wandering over the moor, how he went out to it, and his astonishment at recognizing from the white forehead, which has given the favorite his name, the chance had put in his power the only horse which could beat the one which he had put his the one upon which he had put his money. Then I described how his first impulse had been to lead him back to King's Pyland, and how the devil had shown him how he could hide the horse until the race was over, and how he had led it back and concealed it at Mapleton. Then I told him every detail. He gave it. When I told him every detail, he gave it up, and thought only of saving his own skin. But his stables have been searched. Oh, an old horse-faker like him has many a dodge. But are you not afraid to leave the horse in his power now, since he has been every interest in injuring it? My dear fellow, he will guard it as the apple of his eye. He knows that his only hope of mercy is to produce it safe. Colonel Ross did not impress me as a man who would be likely to show much mercy in any case. The matter does not rest with Colonel Ross. I follow my good methods, and tell as much or as little as I choose. That is the advantage of being unofficial. I don't know whether you observed it, Watson, but the Colonel's manner has been just a trifle cavalier to me. I am inclined now to have a little amusement at his expense. Say nothing to him about the horse. Certainly not without your permission. And, of course, this is all quite a minor point compared to the question of who killed John Straker. You will devote yourself to that? On the contrary, we both go back to London by the night's train. I was thunderstruck by my friend's words. We had only been a few hours in Devonshire, and that he should give up on an investigation which he had begun so brilliantly, was quite incomprehensible to me. Not a word more could I draw from him until we were back at the trainer's house. The Colonel and the inspector were awaiting us in the parlour. "My friend and I returned to town by the express train," said Holmes. "We have had a charming little breath of your beautiful Dartmoor air." The inspector opened his eyes, and the Colonel's lip curled in a sneer. "So you despair of arresting the murderer of poor Straker?" said he. Holmes shrugged his shoulders. "There are certainly grave difficulties in the way," said he. "I have every hope, however, that your horse will start upon Tuesday, and I beg that you will have your jockey in readiness. Might I ask for a photograph of Mr. John Straker?" The inspector took one from his envelope in his pocket and handed it to him. "My dear Gregor, you anticipate all my wants. If I might ask you to wait here for an instant, I have a question which I should like to put to the maid." "I must say that I am rather disappointed in our London consultant," said Colonel Ross bluntly, as my friend left the room. "I do not see that we are any further than when he came." "At least you have his assurance that your horse will run," said I. "Yes, I have his assurance," said the Colonel, with a shrug of his shoulders. "I should prefer to have the horse." I was about to make some reply in deference to my friend when he entered the room again. "Now, gentlemen," said he, "I am quite ready for Tavistock." As we stepped into the carriage, one of the stable lads held the door open for us. A sudden idea came to occur to Holmes, for he leaned forward and touched the lad upon the sleeve. "You have a few sheep in the paddock," he said. "Who attends to them?" "I do, sir." "Have you noticed anything amiss with them of late?" "Well, sir, not of much account, but 3 of them have gone lame, sir." I could see that Holmes was extremely pleased, for he chuckled and rubbed his hands together. "A long shot, Watson, a very long shot," he said, pinching my arm. "Gregory, let me recommend to your attention this singular epidemic among the sheep. Drive on, coachman." Colonel Ross still wore an expression which showed the poor opinion which he had formed of my companion's ability, but I saw by the inspector's face that his attention had been keenly aroused. "You consider that to be important?" he asked. "Exceedingly so." "Is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" "To the curious incident of the dog in the night time." "The dog did nothing in the night time." That was the curious incident, remarked Sherlock Holmes. That is actually a title of a book that came out, I want to say about 10, 12 years ago, something like that. Four days later, Holmes and I were again in the train bound for Winchester to see the race for the Wessex Cup. Colonel Ross met us by appointment outside the station, and we drove in his drag to the course. Colonel Ross met us by appointment outside the station, and we drove in his drag to the course beyond the town. His face was grave, and his manner was cold in the extreme. "I have seen nothing of my horse," said he. "I suppose that you would know him when you saw him?" asked Holmes. The colonel was very angry. "I have been on the turf for 20 years, and never was asked such a question as that before," said he. "A child would know Silver Blaze, with his white forehead and his mottled off foreleg." "How was the betting?" "Well, that is the curious part of it. You could have gotten 15 to 1 yesterday, but the price has become shorter and shorter until you can hardly get 3 to 1 now." Said Holmes. "Somebody knows something, that is clear." As the drag drew up in the enclosure near the grandstand, I glanced at the card to see the entries. It ran, "Wessex Plate, 50 sovs each foot with 1,000 sovs added for 4 and 5 years old. Second, £300. Third, £200. New course, 1 mile and 5 furlongs. 1. Mr. Heath Newton. Red cap, cinnamon jacket. Colonel's Wardlaw's pugilist. Pink cap, blue and black jacket. Lord Backwater's Desborough. Yellow cap and sleeves. Colonel Ross's Silver Blaze, black cap, red jacket. Duke of Balmoral's Iris, yellow and black stripes. Lord Singleford's Rasper, purple cap, black sleeves." "We scratched our other one and put all hopes on your word," said the colonel. "Why, what is that? Silver Blaze favorite?" 5 to 4 against Silver Blaze, roared the ring. 5 to 4 against Silver Blaze. 15 to 5 against Desborough. 5 to 4 on the field. Are you as confused as me? "There are the numbers up," I cried. "There are all 6 there." "All 6 there? Then my horse is running," cried the colonel in great agitation. "But I don't see him. My colors have not passed." "Only 5 have passed. This must be he." As I spoke, a powerful bay horse swept out from the weighing enclosure and cantered past us, bearing on its back the well-known black and red of the colonel. "That's not my horse," cried the owner. "That beast has not a white hair upon his body. What is this that you have done, Mr. Holmes?" "Well, well, let us see how he gets on," said my friend imperturbably. For a few minutes he gazed through his field-glass. "Capital! An excellent start!" he cried suddenly. "There they are, running round the curve." From our drag we had a superb view as they came up the straight. The 6 horses were so close together that a carpet could have covered them, but halfway up the yellow of the Mapleton stable showed to the front. Before they reached us, however, Desborough's bolt was shot, and Colonel's horse, coming away with a rush, passed the post a good 6 lengths before its rival, the Duke of Balmoral's Iris, making a bad third. "It's my race anyhow," gasped Colonel, passing his hand over his eyes. "I confess that I can make neither head nor tail of it. Don't you think that you have kept up your mystery long enough, Mr. Holmes?" "Certainly, Colonel. You shall know everything. Let us all go round and have a look at the horse together. Here he is," he continued, as we made our way into the weighing enclosure, where only owners and their friends find admittance. "You have only to wash his face and his leg in spirits of wine, and you will find that he is the same old Silver Blaze as ever." "You take my breath away. I found him in the hands of a faker, and took the liberty of running him just as he was sent over. My dear sir, you have done wonders. The horse looks very fit and well. It never went better in his life. I owe you 1,000 apologies for having doubted your ability. You have done me a great service by recovering my horse. You would do me a greater still if you could lay your hands on the murderer of John Straker." "I have done so," said Holmes quietly. The colonel and I stared at him in amazement. "You have got him? Where is he, then?" "He is here." "Here? Where?" "In my company at the present moment." The colonel flushed angrily. "I quite recognize that I am under obligations to you, Mr. Holmes," said he, "but I must regard that you have just said as either a very bad joke or an insult." Sherlock Holmes laughed. "I assure you that I have not associated with you the crime, Colonel," said he. "The real murderer is standing immediately behind you." He stepped past and laid his hand upon the glossy neck of the thoroughbred. "The horse?" cried both the colonel and myself. "Yes, the horse, and it may lessen his guilt if I say that it was done in self-defense, and that John Straker was a man who was entirely unworthy of your confidence. But there goes the bell, and as I stand to win a little on this next race, I shall defer a more lengthy explanation until the more fitting time." We had the corner of a Pullman car to ourselves that evening as we whirled back to London, and I fancy that the journey was a short one to Colonel Ross as well as to myself, as we listened to our companion's narrative of the events which had occurred to the Dartmoor training stables upon that Monday night, and the means by which we had unravelled them. "I confess," said he, "that any theories which I had formed from the newspaper reports were entirely erroneous, and yet there were indications there, and they had they not been overlaid by other details which concealed their true import. I went to Devonshire with the conviction that Fitzroy Simpson was the true culprit, though, of course, I saw that the evidence against him was by no means complete. It was while I was in the carriage, just as we reached the trainer's house, that the immense significance of the curried mutton occurred to me. You may remember that I was distrait and remained sitting after you had all alighted. I was marveling in my own mind how I could possibly have overlooked so obvious a clue. "I confess," said the colonel, "that even now I cannot see how it helps us. It was the first link in my chain of reasoning. Powdered opium is by no means tasteless. The flavor is not disagreeable, but it is perceptible. Were it mixed with any ordinary dish, the eater would have undoubtedly detected it, and would probably eat no more. A curry was exactly the medium which would disguise this taste. By no possible supposition could this stranger Fitzroy Simpson have caused curry to be served in the trainer's family that night. And it is surely too monstrous a confidence to suppose that he happened to come along with powdered opium upon the very night when a dish happened to be served which would disguise the flavor. This is unthinkable. Therefore, Simpson becomes eliminated from the case, and our attention centers upon Straker and his wife, the only two people who could have chosen curried mutton for supper that night. The opium was added after the dish was set aside for the stable boy, for the others had the same for supper with no ill effects. Which of them, then, had access to that dish without the maid seeing them? Before deciding that question, I had grasped the significance of the silence of the dog, for one true inference invariably suggests others. The Simpson incident had shown me that a dog was kept in the stables, and yet, though someone had been in and had fetched out a horse, he had not barked enough to arouse the two lads in the loft. Obviously, the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. I was already convinced, or almost convinced, that John Straker went down to the stables in the dead of the night and took out Silver Blaze. For what purpose? For a dishonest one, obviously, or why should he drug his own stable boy? And yet I was at a loss to know why. There have been cases before now where trainers have made sure of great sums of money by laying against their own horses through agents and then preventing them from winning by fraud. Sometimes it is a polling jockey, sometimes it is some surer and subtler means. What was it here? I hoped that the contents of his pockets might help me to form a conclusion. And they did so. You could not have forgotten the singular knife which was found in the dead man's hand, a knife which certainly no sane man would choose for a weapon. It was, as Dr. Watson told us, a form of knife which is used for the most delicate operations known in surgery, and it was to be used for a delicate operation that night. You must know, with your wide experience of turf matters, Colonel Ross, that it is possible to make a slight nick upon the tendons of a horse's ham, and to do it subcutaneously, so as to leave absolutely no trace. A horse so treated would develop a slight lameness, which would be put down to a strain in exercise or a touch of rheumatism. Yeah, there we go. But never to foul play. "Villain! Scoundrel!" cried the colonel. "We have here the explanation of why John Straker wished to take the horse out onto the moor. So spirited a creature would have certainly roused the soundest of sleepers when it felt the prick of the knife, but was absolutely necessary to do it in the open air." "You have been blind!" cried the colonel. "Of course, I have been blind! Of course, that was why he needed the candle and struck the match." "Undoubtedly. But in examining his belongings, I was fortunate enough to discover not only the method of the crime, but even its motives. As a man of the world, Colonel, you know that men do not carry other people's bills about in their pockets. We have, most of us, quite enough to do to settle our own. I at once concluded that Straker was leading a double life and keeping a second establishment. The nature of the bill showed us there was a lady in the case, and one who had expensive tastes. Liberal as you are with your servants, one hardly expects that they can buy 20-guinea walking dresses for their women. I questioned Mrs. Straker as to the dress without her knowing it, and having satisfied myself that it had never reached her, I made a note of the milliner's address, and felt that by calling there, with Straker's photograph, I could easily dispose of the mythical Derbyshire. From that time on, all was plain. Straker had led out the horse to a hollow, where his light would be invisible. Simpson, in his flight, had dropped the cravat, and Straker had picked up with some idea, perhaps, that he might use it in securing the horse's leg. Once in the hollow, he had got behind the horse, and had struck a light, but the creature, frightened at the sudden glare, and with the strange instinct of animals feeling that some mischief was intended, had lashed out, and the steel shoe had struck Straker full on the forehead. He had already, in spite of the rain, taken off his overcoat in order to do his delicate task, and, as he fell, his knife gashed his thigh. Do I make it clear? "Wonderful!" cried the colonel. "Wonderful! You might have been there!" My final shot was, I confess, a very long one. It struck me that so astute a man as Straker would not undertake this delicate tendon-nicking without a little practice. What could he practice on? My eyes fell upon the sheep, and I asked a question, which, rather to my surprise, showed that my surmise was correct. "You have made it pretty clear, Mr. Holmes." When I returned to London, I called upon the milliner, who at once recognized Straker as an excellent customer of the name of Derbyshire, who had a very dashing wife with a strong particularity for expensive dresses. Partiality. I have no doubt that this woman had plunged him over head and ears in debt, and so led him into this miserable plot. "You have explained all but one thing," cried the colonel. "Where was the horse?" It bolted and was cared for by one of your neighbors. We must have an amnesty in that direction, I think. This is Clapham Junction, if I am not mistaken, and we shall be in Victoria in less than 10 minutes. If you care to smoke a cigar in our rooms, Colonel, I shall be happy to give you any other details which might interest you. that is the end of the adventure of Silver Blaze. I'm going to take just a little break, drink a little, refresh the voice. How are you doing, John and Fairy? Fairy, if you're still here, I know it's really late for you. Pretty late. Is it quite midnight yet for you? I'm not really sure how, the difference between here and there. Oh, dear. Oh, yeah, I had forgot. If you like a good story time, LeVar Burton is doing some live streaming. I don't know at what times or if he's still doing it. Oh, nice. Ooh, what kind of pizza are you having? And was it takeout or did you have it delivered? I personally, my favorite pizza establishment is Round Table, and I know it's very central to like California or on the West Coast, but that's definitely my favorite. I love their crust. It's really good. And their cheese mix. Ooh. I've never tried meatball on a pizza. Depending on the meatball, that would be delicious. Yeah, maybe sometime in the future. It does sound pretty savory. Yeah, let's see. What was my favorite kind of pizza? I like pepperoni. Oh, okay, cool. So you have like this on your smartphone or something while you're driving. Nice. Yeah, I like Hawaiian pizzas are good. I like pepperoni. I really like a good... Ooh, okay. I used to eat Papa John's actually a lot in college. They had this deal. It was like a special price for a large one topping, so I always used to get pineapple pizza, and I know like half the world reviles pineapple pizza, but I don't know. I like it. It's tart and sweet and savory all at the same time. It's interesting. But yeah, I like a good Greek pizza. It's really good. But without onions. I'm not a fan of onions on pizza. Yeah. Anyways, let us get back to it. With The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. In choosing a few typical cases which illustrate the remarkable mental quality of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I have endeavored as far as possible to select those which presented the minimal of sensationalism, while offering a fair field of his talents. It is, however, unfortunately impossible to entirely separate the sensational from the criminal, and a chronicler is left in the dilemma that he must either sacrifice details which are essential to his statement, and so give a false impression of the problem, or we must use matter which chance and not choice have provided him with. With this short preface, I shall turn to my notes of what proved to be a strange, though peculiarly terrible chain of events. It was a blazing hot day in August. Baker Street was like an oven, and the glare of the sunlight upon the yellow brickwork of the house across the road was painful to the eye. It was hard to believe that these were the same walls which loomed so gloomily through the fogs of winter. Our blinds were half drawn, and Holmes lay curled upon the sofa, reading and rereading a letter which he had received by the morning post. For myself, my term of service in India had trained me to stand heat better than cold, and a thermometer at 90 was no hardship. But the morning paper was uninteresting. Parliament had ridden, everybody was out of town, and I yearned for glades of the New Forest, or the shingle of South Sea. A depleted bank account had caused me to postpone my holiday, and as to my companion, neither the country nor the sea presented the slightest attraction to him. He loved to lie in the very center of 5 millions of people, with his filament stretching out and running through them, responsive to very little rumor or suspicion of unsolved crime. Nowadays, the thought of being in the middle of 5 million people is rather unsettling, given, what's going around the world right now. I have never felt more lucky to live so rurally as I do. Appreciation of nature found no place among his many gifts, and his only change was when he turned his mind from the evil doer of the town to track down his brother of the country. Finding that Holmes was too absorbed for conversation, I had tossed aside the barren paper, and, leaning back in my chair, I fell into a brown study. Suddenly, my companion's voice broke in upon my thoughts. "You are right, Watson," said he. "It does seem a quite preposterous way of settling a dispute." "Most preposterous," I exclaimed, and then suddenly realizing how he had echoed the inmost thought of my soul, I sat up in my chair and glared at him in blank amazement. "What is this, Holmes?" said I. "This is beyond anything which I could have imagined." He laughed heartily at my perplexity. "You remember," said he, "that some little time ago when I read to you the passage in one of Poe's stretches, in which a close reasoner follows the unspoken thoughts of his companion, you were inclined to treat the matter as a mere tour de force of the author. On my remarking that I was constantly in the habit of doing the same thing, you expressed incredulity." "Oh, no!" "Perhaps not with your tongue, my dear Watson, but certainly with your eyebrows. So, when I saw you throw down your paper and enter upon a train of thought, I was very happy to have the opportunity of reading it off, and eventually of breaking into you as a proof that I had been in rapport with you. But I was still far from being satisfied. In the example which you read to me," said I, "the reasoner drew his conclusions from the action of the man whom he observed. If I remember right, he stumbled over a heap of stones, looking up at the stars, and so on. But I have been seated quietly in my chair, and what clues can I have given you?" "You do yourself an injustice. The features were given to man as the means by which we shall express his emotions, and yours are faithful servants." "Do you mean to say that you read my train of thoughts from my features?" "Your features, and especially your eyes. Perhaps you cannot yourself recall how your reverie commenced?" "No, I cannot." "Then I will tell you. After throwing down your paper, which was the action which drew my attention to you, you sat for half a minute with a vacant expression. Then your eyes fixed themselves upon your newly framed picture of General Gordon, and I saw by the alteration in your face that a train of thought had been started. But it did not lead very far. Your eyes flashed across the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, which stands upon the top of your books. You then glanced up at the wall, and of course your meaning was obvious. You were thinking that if the portrait was framed, it would just cover that bare space and correspond with Gordon's picture over there." "You have followed me wonderfully," I exclaimed. "So far I could hardly have gone astray. But now your thoughts went back to Beecher, and you looked hard across as if you were studying the character in his features. Then your eyes ceased to pucker, and you continued to look across, and your face was thoughtful. You were recalling the incident of Beecher's career. I was well aware that you could not do this without thinking of the mission which we undertook on behalf of the North at the time of the Civil War, for I remember your expressing your passionate indignation at the way in which he was received by the more turbulent of our people. You felt so strongly about it that I knew you could not think of Beecher without thinking of that also. Then a moment later I saw your eyes wander away from the picture. I suspected that your mind had now turned to the Civil War, and when I observed that your lips set, your eyes sparkled, and your hands clenched, I was positive that you were indeed thinking of the gallantry which was shown by both sides in that desperate struggle. But then again your face grew sadder, you shook your head, you were dwelling upon the sadness and horror and useless waste of life. Your hand stole towards your own old wound, and a small quiver in your lips which showed me that the ridiculous side of this method of settling international questions was forced itself upon your mind. At this point I agree with you that it was preposterous, and was glad to find that all my deductions had been correct. Absolutely, said I. Oh, did you have a question, John? Or was that just a mistype? I'll pause for a moment. I guess it might have been a mistype, but I'll keep looking up the chat just in case. Absolutely, said I. And now that you have explained it, I confess that I am amazed as before. It was very superficial, my dear Watson, I assure you. I should not have intruded upon your attention had you not shown some incredulity the other day, but I have in my hands here a little problem which may prove to be more difficult of solution than my small essay in thought reading. Have you observed in the paper a short paragraph referring to the remarkable content of a packet sent through the post to Miss Susan Cushing of Cross Station, Croydon? No, I saw nothing. Ah, then you must have overlooked it. Just toss it over to me. Here it is, under the financial column. Perhaps you would be good enough to read it aloud. I picked up the paper, which he had thrown back to me, and read the paragraph indicated. It was headed, "A Gruesome Packet." Miss Susan Cushing, living at Cross Street, Croydon, had been made the victim of what must be regarded in a peculiarly revolting practical joke, unless some more sinister meaning should prove to be attached to the incident. At 2:00 yesterday afternoon, a small packet wrapped in brown paper was handed in by the postman. A cardboard box was inside, which was filled with coarse salt. On emptying this, Miss Cushing was horrified to find 2 human ears, apparently quite freshly severed. The box had been sent by parcel post from Belfast upon the morning before. There is no indication as to the sender, and the matter is the more mysterious as Miss Cushing, who is a maiden lady of 50, has led a most retired life, and has so few acquaintances or correspondents that it is a rare event for her to receive anything through the post. Some years ago, however, when she resided at Penge, Penge, okay, she let apartments in her house to 3 young medical students whom she was obliged to get rid of on account of their noisy and irregular habits. The police are of opinion that this outrage may have been perpetrated upon Miss Cushing by these youths, who showed her a grudge and who hoped to frighten her by sending her these relics of the dissecting rooms. Some probability is lent to the theory by the fact that one of these students came from the north of Ireland, and, to the best of Miss Cushing's belief, from Belfast. In the meantime, the matter is being actively investigated, Mr. Lestrade, one of the very smartest of our detective officers, being in charge of the case. So much for the Daily Chronicle, said Holmes, as I finished reading. Now for our friend Lestrade. I had a note from him this morning in which he says, "I think that this case is very much in your line. We have every hope of clearing the matter up, but we find little difficulty in getting anything to work upon. We have, of course, wired to the Belfast post office, but a large number of parcels were handed in upon that day, and they have no means of identifying this particular one, or of remembering the sender. The box is a half-pound box of honey-dew tobacco, and does not help us in any way. The medical student theory still appears to me to be the most feasible, but if you should have a few hours to spare, I should be very happy to see you out there. I shall be either at the house or in the police station all day. What say you, Watson? Can you rise superior to the heat and run down to Croydon with me and on the off chance of a case for your annals? I was longing for something to do. You shall have it then. Ring for your boots and tell them to order a cab. I'll be back in a moment, when I have changed my dressing gown and filled my cigar case. A shower of rain fell while we were in the train, and the heat was far less oppressive in Croydon than in town. Holmes had sent on a wire so that Lestrade, as wiry and dapper and as ferret-like as ever, was waiting for us at the station. A walk of 5 minutes took us to Cross Street, where Miss Cushing resided. It was a very long street of 2-story brick houses, neat and prim, with whitened stone steps and little groups of aproned women gossiping at the door. Halfway down, Lestrade stopped and tapped at a door, which was opened by a small servant girl. Miss Cushing was sitting in the front room, into which we were ushered. She was a placid-faced woman with large, gentle eyes and grizzled hair curving down over her temples on each side. A working antimacassar lay upon her lap, and a basket of colored silks stood upon a stool beside her. "They are in the outhouse, those dreadful things," said she as Lestrade entered. "I wish that you would take them away altogether." "So I shall, Miss Cushing. I only kept them here until my friend Mr. Holmes should have seen them in your presence. "Why in my presence, sir?" "In case you wish to ask any questions." "What is the use of asking me questions when I tell you that I know nothing whatever about it?" "Quite so, madam," said Holmes, in his soothing way. "I have no doubt that you have been annoyed more than enough already over this business." "Indeed I have, sir. I am a quiet woman, and I live a retired life. It is something new to me to see my name in the papers and to find the police in my house. I won't have those things in here, Mr. Lestrade. If you wish to see them, you must go to the outhouse." It was a small shed in the narrow garden which led down behind the house. Lestrade went in and brought out a yellow cardboard box with a piece of brown paper and some string. There was a bench at the edge of the path, and we all sat down while Holmes examined one by one the articles which Lestrade had handed to him. "The string is exceedingly interesting," he remarked, holding it up to the light and sniffing at it. "What do you make of this string, Lestrade?" "It has been tarred." "Precisely. It is a piece of tarred twine. You have also no doubt remarked that Miss Cushing has cut the cord with a scissor, as can be seen by the double fray on each side. This is of importance." "I cannot see the importance," said Lestrade. "The importance lies in the fact that the knot is left intact, and that this knot is of a peculiar character." "It is very neatly tied. I had already made a note to that effect," said Lestrade complacently. "So much for the string, then," said Holmes, smiling. "Now, for the small wrapper, brown paper with a distinct smell of coffee. What, you did not observe it? You did not observe it? I think there can be no doubt about it. An address printed on rather straggling characters, Miss S. Cushing, Cross Street, Croydon, done with a broad pointed pen, probably a J, and with very inferior ink. I think the J is the size of the pen tip. The word Croydon has been spelt originally with an I, which has been changed to Y. The parcel was directed then by a man. The printing is distinctly masculine, of limited education, and unacquainted with the town of Croydon. So far, so good. The box is a yellow half-pound honeydew box, which nothing distinctive save 2 thumb marks at the left bottom corner. It is filled with rough salt of the quality used for preserving hides and other of the coarser commercial purposes, and embedded in it are these 2 singular enclosures. He took out the 2 ears as he spoke, and laying a board across his knee, he examined them minutely, while Lestrade and I, bending forward on each side of him, glanced alternately at these dreadful relics and at the thoughtful, eager face of our companion. Finally, he returned them to the box once more, and sat for a while in deep thought. "You have observed, of course," said he at last, "that the ears are not a pair." "Yes, I have noticed that, but if this were the practical joke of some students from the dissecting room, it would be as easy for them to send 2 odd ears as a pair." "Precisely, but this is not a practical joke." Sorry, just moving my keyboard. "You are sure of it?" "The presumption is strongly against it. Bodies in the dissecting room are injected with preservation fluid. These ears bear no signs of it. They are fresh, too. They have been cut off with a blunt instrument, which would hardly happen if a student had done it. Again, carbolic and rectified spirits would be the preservatives which would suggest themselves to the medical mind, certainly not rough salt. I repeat that there is no practical joke here, but that we are investigating a serious crime." A vague thrill ran through me as I listened to my companion's words and saw the stern gravity which had hardened his features. This brutal preliminary seemed to shadow forth some strange and inexplicable horror in the background. Lestrade, however, shook his head like a man who was only half convinced. "There are objections to the joke theory, no doubt," said he, "but there were much stronger reasons against the other. We know that this woman has led a most quiet and respectable life at Penge, and here for the last 20 years. She has hardly been away from her home for a day during that time. Why on earth, then, would any criminal send her the proofs of his guilt, especially as, unless she is a most consummate actress, she understands quite as little of the matter as we do?" "That is the problem which we have to solve," Holmes answered, and for my part, I shall set about it by presuming that my reasoning is correct, and that a double murder has been committed. One of these ears is a woman's, small, finely formed, and pierced for an earring. The other is a man's, sunburned, discolored, and also pierced for an earring. These 2 people are presumably dead, or we should have heard their story before now. Today is Friday. The packet was posted on Thursday morning. The tragedy then occurred on Wednesday or Tuesday, or earlier. If the 2 people were murdered, who but their murderer would have sent this sign of his work to Miss Cushing? We may take it that the sender of the packet is the man whom we want, but we must have some strong reason for But he must have some strong reason for sending Miss Cushing this packet. What reason, then? It must have been to tell her that the deed was done, or to pain her, perhaps. But in that case she knows who it is. Does she know? I doubt it. If she knew, why should she call the police in? She might have buried the ears, and no one would have been the wiser. That is what she would have done if she had wished to shield the criminal. But if she does not wish to shield him, she would give him a name. There is a tangle here which needs straightening out." He had been talking in a high, quick voice, staring blankly up over the garden fence, but now he sprang briskly to his feet and walked toward the house. "I have a few questions to ask Miss Cushing," said he. "In that case I may leave you here," said Lestrade, "for I have had another small business on hand. I think that I have nothing further to learn from Miss Cushing. You will find me at the police station." "We shall look in on our way to the train," answered Holmes. A moment later he and I were back in the front room, where the impassive lady was still quietly working away at her antimacassar. She put it down on her lap as we entered, and looked at us with her frank, searching blue eyes. "I am convinced, sir," she said, "that this matter was a mistake, and that the parcel was never meant for me at all. I have said this several times to the gentleman from Scotland Yard, but he simply laughs at me. I have not an enemy in the world as far as I know, so why should anyone play me such a trick? I am coming to be of the same opinion, Miss Cushing, said Holmes, taking a seat beside her. I think that it is more than probable. He paused, and I was surprised on glancing round to see that she was staring with singular intentness at the lady's profile. Surprise and satisfaction were both of an instant to be read upon his eager face, though when she glanced round to find out the cause of his silence, he had become as demure as ever. I stared hard myself at her flat, grizzled hair, her trim cap, her little gilt earrings, her placid features, but I could see nothing which could account for my companion's evident excitement. There were one or two questions. "Oh, I am weary of questions," cried Mrs. Cushing impatiently. "You have 2 sisters, I believe." "How could you know that?" "I observed the very instant that I entered the room that you have a portrait group of 3 ladies upon the mantelpiece, one of whom is undoubtedly yourself, while the others are so exceedingly like you that there could be no doubt of the relationship." "Yes, you're quite right. Those are my sisters, Sarah and Mary. And here at my elbow is another portrait taken at Liverpool of your younger sister in the company of a man who appears to be a steward by his uniform. I observed that she was unmarried at the time." "You are very quick at observing." "It is my trade." "Well, you are quite right. But she was married to Mr. Browner a few days afterwards. He was on the South American line where that was taken." Oh, thank you for following, Carlos. How are you doing?" "I'm just taking a quick pause to say hello." We are now at 27 followers. We're over halfway to getting, oh goodness, now I can never, affiliate. We're getting closer to affiliate. Thank you very much for following again. Now I have to find my place. Aha, there we go. Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you're enjoying it. All of my Storytime streams, I post them up on my YouTube, and you'll find the link below. And also, let me give you an invite to my Discord. It's not a very active one yet, but it is, yeah. We have several different topics on there, book topic, game topic, just a whole bunch of them. And then I also have a Twitter, which the link is below to that as well. We're about halfway through our second story today. Okay, I found my place. Here we go. "Well, you are quite right, but she was married to Mr. Browner a few days afterwards. He was on the South American line when that was taken, but he was so fond of her that he couldn't abide to leave her for so long, and he got into Liverpool and London boats." "Ah, the Conqueror, perhaps." "No, the Mayday, when last I heard. Jim came down here to see me once. That was before he broke the pledge. But afterwards he would always take drink when he was ashore, and a little drink would send him stark, staring mad. Ah, it was a bad day that ever he took a glass in his hand again. First he dropped me, and then he quarrelled with Sarah, and now that Mary has stopped writing, we don't know how things are going with them." It was evident that Miss Cushing had come upon a subject on which she felt very deeply. Like most people who lead a lonely life, she was shy at first, but ended up becoming extremely communicative. She told us many details about her brother-in-law, the steward, and then wandering off onto the subject of her former lodgers, the medical students, she gave us a long account of their delinquencies, with their names and those of their hospitals. Let's see. Well, I have a Facebook, but that is under my real name, so I don't post that. But other than that, I think it's just Twitter and Discord. I don't have an Instagram because I don't have a smartphone. And I can't really think of any other Social medias. Oh, yes, I do have a Twitter, and I believe I have the link to that below, but it's just basically Storytime Sunny on Twitter. Yeah. Holmes listened attentively to everything, throwing in a question from time to time. "About your second sister, Sarah," said he. "I wonder, since you are both maiden ladies, that you do not keep house together." "Ah, you don't know Sarah's temper, or you would wonder no more. I tried it when I came to Croydon, and we kept on until about 2 months ago, when we had to part. I don't want to say a word against my own sister, but she was always meddlesome and hard to please, was Sarah." "You say that she quarrelled with your Livermore relations?" "Yes, and they were the best of friends at one time. Why, she went up there to live just in order to be near them, and now she has no word hard enough for Mr. Jim Browner. The last 6 months that she was here, she would speak of nothing but his drinking and his ways. He had caught her meddling, and I suspect, and given her a bit of his mind, and that was the start of it." "Thank you, Miss Cushing," said Holmes, rising and bowing. "Your sister Sarah lives, I think you said, at New Street, Wallington? Goodbye. I am very sorry that you should have been troubled over a case with which, as you say, you have nothing whatever to do." There was a cab passing as we came out, and Holmes hailed it. "How far to Wallington?" he asked. "Only about a mile, sir." "Very good. Jump in, Watson. We must strike while the iron is hot. Simple as the case is, there have been 1 or 2 very instructive details in connection with it. Just pull up at a telegraph office as you pass, cabby." Holmes sent off a short wire, and for the rest of the drive lay back in the cab with the hat tilted over his nose to keep the sun from his face. Our driver pulled up at a house which was not unlike the one which he had just quitted. My companion ordered him to wait, and had his hand upon the knocker when the door opened and a grave young gentleman in black with a very shining hat appeared on the step. "Is Miss Sarah Cushing at home?" asked Holmes. "Miss Sarah Cushing is extremely ill," said he. "She has been suffering since yesterday from brain symptoms of great severity, and as her medical adviser, I cannot possibly take the responsibility of allowing anyone to see her. I should recommend you to call again in 10 days. He drew on his gloves, closed the door, and marched off down the street. "Well, if we can't, we can't," said Holmes cheerfully. "Perhaps she could not or would not have told you much." "I did not wish her to tell me anything. I only wanted to look at her. However, I think that I have got all that I want. Drive us to some decent hotel, cabby, where we may have some lunch, and afterward we shall drop down upon our friend Lestrade at the police station." We had a pleasant little meal together, during which Holmes would talk about nothing but violins, narrating with great exultation how he had purchased his own Stradivarius, which was worth at least 500 guineas, at a Jew broker's in in Tottenham Court Road for 55 shillings. This led him to Paganini, and we sat for an hour over a bottle of claret, while he told me anecdote after anecdote of that extraordinary man. The afternoon was far advanced, and the hot glare had softened into a mellow glow before we found ourselves at the police station. Lestrade was waiting for us at the door. "A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Ha! It is the answer!" He tore it open, glanced his eyes over it, and crumpled it into his pocket. "That's all right," said he. "Have you found out anything?" "I've found out everything." "What?" Lestrade stared at him in amazement. "Are you joking?" "I was never more serious in my life. A shocking crime has been committed, and I think that I have now laid bare every detail of it." "And the criminal?" Holmes scribbled a few words upon the back of one of his visiting cards and threw it over to Lestrade. "That is it," he said. "You cannot effect an arrest until tomorrow night at the earliest. I should prefer that you would not mention my name at all in connection with the case, as I choose to be associated only with those crimes which present some difficulty in their solution. Come on, Watson." We strode off together to the station, leaving Lestrade still staring with a delighted face at the card which Holmes had thrown him. "The case," said Sherlock Holmes as we chattered over our cigars that night in our rooms at Baker Street, "is one where, as an investigator, which you have chronicled under the names of the Study in Scarlet and the Signs of Four, we have been compelled to reason backwards from effects to causes. I've written to Lestrade asking him to supply us with the details which are now wanting, and which we will only get after he has secured this man. That he may be safely trusted to do, for although he is absolutely devoid of reason, he is as tenacious as a bulldog when he once understands what he has to do, and indeed it is just this tenacity which has brought him to the top at Scotland Yard." "Your case is not complete, then?" I asked. "It is fairly complete in essentials. We know who the author of the revolting business is, although one of the victims still escapes us. Of course, you have formed your own conclusions. I presume that this Jim Browner, the steward of the Liverpool boat, is the man whom you suspect." "Oh, it is more than a suspicion. And yet I cannot see anything save very vague indications." "On the contrary, to my mind nothing could be more clear. Let me run over the principal steps. We approached the case, you remember, with an absolutely blank mind, which is always an advantage. We had formed no theories. We were simply there to observe and to draw inferences from our observations. What did we see first? A very placid and respectable lady, who seemed quite innocent of any secret, and a portrait which showed me that she had 2 younger sisters. It instantly flashed across my mind that the box might have been meant for one of these. I set the idea aside as one which could be disproved or confirmed at our leisure. Then we went to the garden, as you remember, and we saw the very singular contents of the little yellow box. The string was of the quality which is used by the sailmakers aboard ships, and at once a whiff of the sea was perceptible in our investigation. When I observed that the knot was one which is popular with sailors, that the parcel had been posted at a port, and that the male ear was pierced for an earring, which is so much more common among sailors than landsmen, I was quite certain that all the actors in the tragedy were to be found among our seafaring classes. When I came to examine the address of the packet, I observed that it was Miss S. Cushing. Now, the oldest sister would of course be Miss Cushing, and although her initial was S, it might belong to one of the others as well. In the case, we should have to commence our investigations from a fresh basis altogether. I therefore went into the house with the intention of clearing up this point. I was about to assure Miss Cushing that I was convinced that a mistake had been made when you may remember that I came suddenly to a stop. The fact was that I had just seen something which filled me with surprise and at the same time narrowed the field of our inquiry immensely. As a medical man, you are aware, Watson, that there is no part of the body which varies so much as the human ear. Each ear is, as a rule, quite distinctive and differs from all other ones. In last year's Anthropological Journal, you will find 2 short monographs from my pen upon the subject. I had therefore examined the ears in the box with the eyes of my expert, and had carefully noted their anatomical peculiarities. Imagine my surprise, then, when on looking at Miss Cushing I perceived that our ear corresponded exactly with the female ear which I had just inspected. The matter was entirely beyond coincidence. There was the same shortening of the pinna, the same broad curve of the upper lobe, the same convolution of the inner cartilage, and in all essentials it was the same ear. Of course, I at once saw the enormous importance of the observation. It was evidence that the victim was a blood relative, and probably a very close one. I began to talk to her about her family, and you understand that she at once gave us some exceedingly valuable details. In the first place, her sister's name was Sarah, and her address had, until recently, been the same, so that it was quite obvious how the mistake had occurred, and whom the packet was meant for. Then we heard of this steward married to the third sister, and learned that he had at one time been so intimate with Miss Sarah that she had actually gone up to Liverpool to be near the Brownings. But a quarrel had afterward divided them. This quarrel had put a stop to all communications for some months, so that if Browner had occasion to address a packet to Miss Sarah, he would undoubtedly have done so to her old address. And now the matter had begun to straighten itself out wonderfully. We had learned of the existence of the steward, an impulsive man of strong passions. You remember that he threw up what must have been a very superior birth, in order to be nearer to his wife, subject, too, to occasional fits of hard drinking. We had reason to believe that his wife had been murdered, and that a man, presumably a seafaring man, had been murdered at the same time. Jealousy, of course, at once suggests itself as to the motive of the crime. And why should these proofs of the deed be sent to Miss Sarah Cushing? Probably because during her residence in Liverpool she had some hand in bringing about the events which led to the tragedy. You will observe that this line of boats calls at Belfast, Dublin, and Waterford, so that, presuming that Browner had committed the deed and had embarked at once upon his steamer, the May Day, Belfast would be the first place at which he could post his terrible packet. A second solution was at this stage obviously possible, and although I thought it exceedingly unlikely, I was determined to elucidate it before going further. An unsuccessful lover might have killed Mr. and Mrs. Browning, and the male ear might have belonged to the husband. There were many grave objections to this theory, but it was conceivable. I therefore sent off a telegram to my friend Algar of the Liverpool force, and asked him to find out if Mrs. Browning were at home, and if Browner had departed in the Mayday. Mrs. Browner were home, and if Browner had departed in the Mayday. Then he went on to Wallington to visit Miss Sarah. I was curious in the first place to see how far the family ear had been reproduced in her. Then, of course, she might give us very important information, but I was not sanguine that she would. She must have heard of the business the day before, once all Croydon was ringing with it, and she alone could have understood whom the packet was meant for. If she had been willing to help justice, she would probably have communicated with the police already. However, it was clearly our duty to see her, so we went. We found out the news of the arrival of the packet, for her illness, dated from that time, had such an effect upon her as to bring on brain fever. It was clearer than ever that she understood its full significance, but equally clear that we should have to wait some time for any assistance from her. However, we were really independent of her help. Our answers were awaiting us at the police station, where I had directed Algar to send them. Nothing could be more conclusive. Mrs. Browner's house had been closed for more than 3 days, and the neighbors were of the opinion that she had gone south to see her relatives. It had been ascertained at the shipping offices that Browner had left abroad of the May Day, and I calculated that she is due in the Thames tomorrow night. When he arrives, he will be met by the obtuse but resolute Lestrade, and I have no doubt that we shall have all our details filled in. Sherlock Holmes was not disappointed in his expectations. 2 days later he received a bulky envelope which contained a short note from the detective and a typewritten document which covered several pages of foolscape. "Lestrade has got him all right," said Holmes, glancing up at me. "Perhaps it would interest you to hear what he says. My dear Mr. Holmes, in accordance with the scheme which we had formed in order to test our theories, the 'we' is rather fine, Watson, is it not? I went down to the Albert Dock yesterday at 6 p.m. and boarded the SS Mayday, belonging to the Liverpool, Dublin, and London Steam Packets Company. On inquiry, I found that there was a steward on board in the name of James Browner, and that he had acted during the voyage in such an extraordinary manner that the captain had been compelled to relieve him of his duties. On descending to his berth, I found him seated upon a chest with his head sunk upon his knees, rocking himself to and fro. He is a big, powerful chap, clean-shaven and very swarthy, something like Aldridge, who helped us in the bogus laundry affair. He jumped up when he heard my business, and I had my whistle to my lips to call a couple of river police around the corner, but he seemed to have no heart in him, and he held out his hands quietly enough for the darbies. We brought him along to the cells, and his box as well, for we thought there might be something incriminating. But, bar a big sharp knife, such as most sailors have, we got nothing for our troubles. However, we find that we shall want no more evidence, for on being brought before the inspector at the station, he asked leave to make a statement, which was, of course, taken down just as he made it by our shorthand man. He was, We had 3 copies typewritten, one of which I enclose. The affair proves, as I always thought it would be, to an extremely simple one, but I am obliged to you for assisting me in my investigation. With kind regards, yours very truly, G. Lestrade. The investigation really was a very simple one, remarked Holmes, but I don't think it struck him in that light when he first called us in. However, let us see what Jim Browner has to say for himself. This is his statement, as made from Inspector Montgomery at the Shadwell police station, and it has the advantage of being verbatim. The name Shadwell just makes me think of Good Omens. If you have not watched or read it, you must. It is wonderful. Have I anything to say? Yes, I have a deal to say. I have to make a clean breast of it all. You can hang me, or you can leave me alone. I don't care a plug which you do. I tell you I've not shut an eye in sleep since I did it, and I don't believe I ever will again until I get past all waking. Sometimes it's his face, and most generally it's hers. I'm never without one or the other before me. He looks frowning and black-like, but she has a kind of surprise upon her face. I, the white lamb. She might well be surprised when she read death on the face that had seldom looked anything but love upon her before. But it was Sarah's fault, and may the curse of a broken man put a blight on her and set the blood rotting in her veins. It's not that I want to clear myself. I know that I went back to drink, like the beast that I was, but she wouldn't have forgiven me. She would have stuck as close to me as a rope to a block if that woman had never darkened our door, for Sarah Cushing loved me. That's the root of the business. She loved me until all her love turned to poisonous hate when she knew that I thought more of my wife's footmark in the mud than I did her whole body and soul. There were 3 sisters altogether. The old one was just a good woman, and the second one is a devil, and the third was an angel. Sarah was 33, and Mary was 29 when I married. We were just as happy as the day was long when we set up house together, and in all Liverpool there was no better woman than my Mary. And then we asked Sarah up for a week, and the week grew into a month, and the one thing led to another until she was just one of ourselves. I was blue ribbon at that time, and we were putting a little money by, and all was as bright as a new dollar. My God, whoever would have thought that it could have come to this? Whoever would have dreamed it? I used to be home for the weekends very often, and sometimes if the ship were held back for cargo, I would have a whole week at a time, and in this way I saw a deal of my sister-in-law Sarah. She was a fine tall woman, black and quick and fierce, with a proud way of carrying her head and a glint from her eye like the spark from flint. But when little Mary was there, I had never a thought for her, and that I swear as I hope for God's mercy. It had It had seemed to me sometimes that she liked to be alone with me or to coax me out for a walk with her, but I had never thought anything of that. But one evening my eyes were opened. I had come up from the ship and found my wife out, but Sarah at home. Where's Mary? I asked. Oh, she's gone to pay some accounts. I was impatient and paced up and down the room. Can't you be happy for 5 minutes without Mary, Jim? Says she. It's a bad compliment to me that you can't be contented with my society for so short a time. That's all right, my lass, said I, putting my hand towards her in a kindly way, but she had it in both hers in an instant, and they burned as if she were in a fever. I looked into her eyes, and I read it all there. There was no need for her to speak, nor for me neither. I frowned and drew my hand away. Then she stood by my side in silence for a bit, and then put up her hand and patted me on the shoulder. Steady on, old Jim, said she, and with a kind of mocking laugh she ran out of the room. Well, from that time, Sarah hated me with her whole heart and soul, and she is a woman who can hate too. I was a fool to let her go on biding with us, a besotted fool. But I never said a word to Mary, for I knew it would grieve her. Things went on such as before, but after a time I began to find that there was a bit of a change in Mary herself. She had always been so trusting and so innocent, but now she became queer and suspicious, wanting to know where I had been, and what I had been doing, and whom my letters were from, and what I had in my pockets, and 1,000 such follies. Day by day she grew queerer and more irritable, and we had causeless rows about nothing. I was fairly puzzled by it all. Sarah avoided me now, but she and Mary were just inseparable. I can see now how she was plotting and scheming and poisoning my wife's mind against me, but I was such a blind beetle that I could not understand it at the time. Then I broke my blue ribbon and began to drink again, but I think I should not have done it if Mary had been the same as ever. She had some reason to be disgusted with me now, and the gap between us began to be wider and wider, and then this Alec Fairbairn chipped in, and things became 1,000 times blacker. It was to see Sarah that he came at my house first, but soon it was to see us, for he was a man with winning ways, and we made friends wherever he went. He was a dashing, swaggering chap, smart and curled, who had seen half the world and could talk of what he had seen. He was good company, I won't deny it, and he was wonderful polite. He had wonderful polite ways with him for a sailor man, so that I think there must have been a time when he knew more of the poop than the forecastle. For a month he was in and out of my house, and never once did it cross my mind that harm might come to his soft, tricky ways. And then at last something made me suspect, and from that day my peace was gone forever. It was only a little thing, too. I had come into the parlor unexpected as I walked in at the door, and I saw a light of welcome on my wife's face. But as she saw who it was, it faded away, and she turned away with a look of disappointment. It was enough for me. There was no one but Alec Fairbank whose step she could have mistaken for mine. If I could have seen him, I should have killed him, for I have always been like a madman when my temper gets loose. Mary saw the devil's light in my eye, and she ran forward with her hands on my sleeve. "Don't, Jim, don't," says she. "Where's Sarah?" I asked in the kitchen. Says she. "Sarah," says I, as I went in. "This man Fairbairn is never to darken my door again." "Why not?" says she. "Because I order it." "Oh," says she, "if my friends were not good enough for this house, then I am not good enough for it either. You can do what you like," says I, "but if Fairbairn shows his face here again, I'll send you one of his ears for a keepsake." She was frightened by my face, I think, for she never answered a word, and the same evening she left my house. Well, I don't know now whether it was pure devilry in the part of this woman, or whether she thought that she could turn me against my wife by encouraging her to misbehave. Anyway, she took a house just 2 streets off and let lodgings to sailors. Fairbairn used to stay there, and Mary would go round to have tea with her sister and him. How often she went I don't know, but I followed her one day, and as I broke in at the door, Fairbairn got away over the back garden wall, like the cowardly skunk that he was. I swore to my wife that I would kill her if I found her in his company again, and I led her back with me, sobbing and trembling and as white as a piece of paper. There was no trace of love between us any longer. I could see that she hated me and feared me, and when the thought of it drove me to drink, then she despised me as well. Well, Sarah found out that she could not make a living in Liverpool, so she went back, as I understand, to live with her sister in Croydon, and things jogged on much the same as ever at home. And then came this last week, and all the misery and ruin. It was in my way. We had gone on the Mayday for a round voyage of 7 days, but a hogshead got loose and started one of our plates, so that we had to put back into port for 12 hours. I left the ship and came home, thinking what a surprise it would be for my wife, and hoping that maybe she would be glad to see me so soon. The thought was in my head as I turned into my own street, and at that moment a cab passed me, and there she was, sitting by the side of Fairbairn, the two chatting and laughing, with never a thought for me as I stood watching them from the footpath. I tell you, I gave you my word on it, and from that moment I was not my own master, and it was all like a dim dream when I look back on it. I had been drinking hard of late, and the two things rather fairly turned my brain. There's something throbbing in my head now like a doctor's hammer, but that morning I seemed to have all Niagara whizzing and buzzing in my head. Well, I took to my heels, and I ran after the cab. I had a heavy oak stick in my hand, and I tell you that I saw red from the first, but as I ran I got cunning too, and hung back a little to see them without being seen. They pulled up soon at the railway station. There was a good crowd round the booking office, so I got quite close to them without being seen. They took tickets for New Brighton. So did I, but I got in 3 carriages behind them. When we reached it, they walked along the parade, and I was never more than 100 yards from them. At last I saw them hire a boat and start for a row, for it was a very hot day, and they thought no doubt that it would be cooler on the water. It was just as if they had been given into my hands. There was a bit of a haze, and you could not see more than a few 100 yards. I hired a boat for myself, and I pulled after them. I could see the blur of their craft when they were going nearly as fast as I, and they must have been a long mile from the shore before I caught them up. The haze was like a curtain all round us, and there were we 3 in the middle of it. My God, shall I ever forget their faces when they saw who was in the boat that was closing in upon them? She screamed out. He swore like a madman and jabbed at me with an oar, for he must have seen death in my eyes. I got past it and got one in with my stick that crushed his head like an egg. I would have spared her, perhaps, for all my madness, but she threw her arms round him, crying out to him, and called him Alec. I struck again, and she lay stretched beside him. I was like a wild beast that had tasted blood. If Sarah had been there, by the Lord, she should have joined them. I pulled out my knife, and, well, there, I've said enough. It gave me a kind of savage joy when I thought how Sarah would feel when she had such signs of what her meddling had brought about. Then I tied the bodies into the boat, stove a plank, and stood by until they had sunk. I knew very well that the owner would think that they had lost their bearings in the haze and had drifted out into the sea. I cleaned myself up, got back to land, and joined my ship without a soul having a suspicion of what had passed. That night I made up the packet for Sarah Cushing, and the next day I sent it from Belfast. There you have the whole truth of it. You can hang me, or do what you like with me, but you cannot punish me as I have been punished already. I cannot shut my eyes, but I see their 2 faces staring at me as if they stared when my boat broke through the haze. I killed them quick, but they are killing me slow. And if I have another night of it, I shall either I shall be either mad or dead before the morning. You won't put me alone into a cell, sir. For pity's sake, don't. You may be treated in your day of agony as you treat me now. Oh, and may you be treated in your day of agony as you treat me now. What is the meaning of it, Watson? Said Holmes solemnly as he laid down the paper. What object is served by this circle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to some end, or else our universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable. But what end? There is the great standing perennial problem to which human reason is as far from an answer as ever. And now we've reached the end of that story. So, I have a question for you, and I'm going to post the question on Discord and Twitter and Facebook as well. There is quite a lot more of Sherlock Holmes, and since they're short stories, we can read 2 in a stream. Did we want to continue with Sherlock Holmes, or did we want to do another story? I have at the ready The Scarlet Pimpernel and The Phantom of the Opera. So I will put those 3 options up. You can let me know what you think at your leisure. And I'll go ahead and end the stream here. I'm going to be doing my Minecraft Undersea adventures. Finally, it's been months. Tonight, probably at about midnight or 1 o'clock. And we'll see what the underwater world gives us. And, and I'll, of course, post this up on YouTube. And tomorrow and Tuesday, I don't know if you had seen, is going to be the all ages story time with, Treasure Island. That's what I'm reading right now. And it's going to be 2 to 4, same time as usual. So I hope to see you there. Bye.